Week 5. America mobilizes and Russia revolts. This week we'll focus on the events of 1917, especially America's entry into World War I and her efforts to mobilize. The war started out as a European quarrel that spilled out into the rest of the world. Woodrow Wilson kept America out of the war throughout his first term. His campaign slogan for his re-election was, "He kept us out of war." But staying neutral wasn't easy. America may have been officially neutral in the war, but individual Americans weren't. Germany lost the public relations battle early on when it violated neutral Belgium in order to attack France as part of the Schlieffen Plan for a quick 1-2 victory in the West and then the East. Germany's bad behavior made it easy for America to slip into trade practices that vastly favored the Allies, and they gave the Allies huge loans. With neutrality like this, who needed enemies? Near the start of the war, the Germans had positioned U-boats, submarines, to sink all commercial ships in the Atlantic that were bound for Allied ports, including American ones. They had to change that policy before long, however. In May of 1915, the Germans sunk the Lusitania, a British passenger ship, killing 128 Americans and over 1,000 others. Many Americans clamored for revenge, but Wilson still resisted war. Instead, he demanded that Germans stop unrestricted submarine attacks. Though the German leaders didn't openly accede, they secretly ordered their U-boats to cease attacking passenger ships. After another attack, however, Wilson issued an ultimatum. Unless the Germans issued a public policy restricting submarine attacks, he would sever diplomatic ties. That's the first step to war. Knowing that American involvement could cost them the war, the Germans had acquiesced and issued the Sussex Pledge. That pledge, to avoid indiscriminate attacks on neutral shipping, held for most of the war. That helped the Allies, a little, and they needed all the help they could get. The war wasn't going well for them. French armies tried to launch a big new offensive, but they couldn't break through German lines. The French troops were so discouraged they mutinied. All French assaults had to be halted, and the armies reorganized before French soldiers would continue the fight. England tried to help. General Haig poured out British blood like water in the mud pits of Passchendaele, also known as the Third Battle of Ypres. It was muddy, bloody, and useless. 250,000 men lost their lives. During one phase of the battle, up to a quarter of those deaths were from men drowning in the mud. The only bright spot was the success of the new Allied tanks. Although they were plagued with mechanical difficulties, the few times they did work, the Germans couldn't stop them. Things were no better on the other side of the trenches, but the German soldiers remained grimly determined. The top German generals assessed the Western Front in the fall of 1916 and found it wanting. They shortened and strengthened the line, moving German troops back to more defensible positions. This effectively stopped the Allied assaults in 1917, but it didn't help the folk back home. The Germans were starving, and their armies were nearly exhausted by fighting a war on two fronts. They turned to two extreme measures in 1917. The Germans took a long shot that paid off beyond their wildest dreams. They financed revolutionary Vladimir Lenin's return to Russia and his efforts to overthrow the Tsar's government, and thus take Russia out of the war. Russia was running out of men and everything else by then, and Lenin's radicals blamed the Tsar for his failure to win. When the Tsar abdicated in March 1917, a provisional government took over, but it suffered even more defeats in the next 6 months. Lenin's Bolsheviks seized power in a coup. Rhetoric students are reading a book called 3 Whys of the Russian Revolution that explains how Lenin managed to take over Russia. Even though they were just a tiny minority, Lenin's Bolsheviks enjoyed some important advantages over their rivals. Pipe says, Lenin treated politics as warfare. He and he alone saw its purpose as conquering power and annihilating all rivals. By annihilation, he meant not merely eliminating them as competitors, but physically exterminating them. Such a view of politics, of course, gave Lenin great advantages in the struggle for power. The Bolsheviks had no qualms about killing. Violence was not a regrettable byproduct of their struggle for power. They used it intentionally as a means to their goal. Lenin craved power for its own sake. Pipe says, Lenin saw himself as the commander-in-chief of an organization committed to permanent political warfare. The rival parties, the socialists, and to some extent the liberals, were populist, believing in the innate wisdom of the Russian people. They were not prepared to fight, and they lost out to a politician for whom struggle was a normal occupation, and peace a mere breathing spell for war. Once Lenin gained control, he sued for peace with Germany, and his foreign minister accepted a harsh treaty, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, that took away most of Imperial Russia's European lands, territories like Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Patriotic Russians were outraged at this, and a bloody civil war erupted within Russia. Lenin's Reds fought against the Whites from the Baltic to the Black Sea and out into Siberia. As the guns fell silent on the Eastern Front, Germany shifted forces. Italy, an ally of France and Britain, had big morale problems. The crumbling Italian line barely withstood a new joint offensive by Germany and Austria-Hungary. With Russia out, Italy reeling, and French troops ready to mutiny, the end seemed near. If only they could knock out Britain. That explains Germany's second desperate move in 1917. They decided to starve Britain into submission by sinking all inbound shipping, even neutral ships. Germany gambled that America would not enter the war, or if it did, it wouldn't matter, and so lifted the Sussex Pledge in January. On February 3rd, a German U-boat sunk an American ship, the Housatonic. Wilson severed diplomatic ties, and after 3 more ships went down, America declared war on April 2, 1917. Germany feared America's industrial capacity, but not her military. If millions of trained professional European soldiers had failed to dent the German lines for over 4 long years, how could farm boys from Tennessee make much difference? Germany believed their U-boats would starve Britain into submission before American soldiers could breach their trenches. President Wilson knew that Germany wasn't afraid of the United States military. It was an all-volunteer army with a small budget and little real experience. Wilson asked Congress to pass a selective service bill, which drafted 2.8 million men into the war. That made the army much larger. Wilson appointed a capable, intelligent, and well-respected general, John J. Pershing, to lead the American Expeditionary Forces. Wilson then set out to put the entire country on a war footing. He set up special wartime agencies that placed private industry under the control of the government so that wartime necessities could be produced. Not only private industry, but also individual citizens were put under government regulation through the enforcement of rationing. Wilson also created the Committee on Public Information, which became the source of propaganda, the systematic and persuasive use of selected truths in order to further a cause. Wilson knew that Americans were not totally unified behind the war effort. He thought they must be made to support it. Wilson insisted it's not an army we must train, it is a nation. So the new government films, posters, and pamphlets showed American soldiers as heroes, fighting to make the world safe for democracy, while enemy soldiers were made to appear as brutal, barbarian subhumans. America's first big overseas war went against some deeply held convictions. The Founding Fathers had grown up in the 18th century, when Europe had fought war after war. A policy of strict isolationism had kept the United States out of overseas trouble for generations. Many patriotic Americans thought Wilson's war was a dangerous mistake, and they said so. These dissenting voices kept America from being completely unified in support of the war. Wilson thought that was a problem. His administration acted like it wasn't enough to just show how important the war was. They had to silence those with different opinions. Congress passed wartime laws which censored the press and punished unpatriotic speech. Some who criticized the war were arrested and imprisoned. This hit German Americans especially hard. Ethnic newspapers were shut down, and in some places the use of any foreign language was forbidden. Towns with German-sounding names changed the name of their town to something patriotic. Even sauerkraut was called Liberty Cabbage. When U.S. citizens of German ancestry were threatened or even persecuted, their rights were seldom protected by law officials. Wilson's leadership really mattered in World War I. For 3 years he had pulled against strong and vocal opinion to put America into the war. His re-election victory was based on the campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war." The Germans calculated that Wilson was too isolationist to change his stance, but they calculated wrong. When the Germans started sinking American ships, Wilson went to war, and nobody can fault him for taking it lightly. His own party had the most to complain about, but any loyal American might object to the mandatory draft, huge spending increases, government control of the economy, and official propaganda. Wilson and Congress shut those voices down through active government censorship. As we'll see next week, however, it worked. America's new military force tipped the balance of the war.